Et donc maintenant, nous allons à un moment que je pense certains d'entre vous attendent depuis longtemps, parce que il y a 5 ans, j'étais dans les couloirs de l'OCP avec une personne qui travaille maintenant dans mon centre et qui est collaboratrice. Et cette personne qui était à l'OCP il y a 5 ans disait je rêve un jour, parce que je viens d'organiser une grande conférence avec lui au Grand Rex devant 2000 personnes, je rêve de voir Eben Alexander au Maroc. Et ce n'était pas la seule à me dire cela. Il y a déjà un grand neurochirurgien marocain m'a dit la même chose. Et donc maintenant, nous allons entendre quelqu'un qui était donc un professeur à Harvard Medical School, un neurochirurgien. Il y a des millions de gens sur Terre qui ont eu ce qu'on appelle une expérience d'approche de la mort, mais à ma connaissance, c'est le premier grand spécialiste du cerveau, et c'est en ça que c'est fascinant. C'est le premier grand spécialiste du cerveau qui a eu cette expérience de mort imminente où son cerveau ne pouvait plus fonctionner, et il était bien placé pour le savoir après coup en voyant les données. Et donc il explique justement comment, dans un livre qui s'appelle La preuve du paradis, titre évidemment assez grand public, il explique comment ça a totalement changé ses conceptions de la conscience. Et là nous entrons vraiment dans un domaine fascinant. Donc nous avons pour la première fois au Maroc donc le professeur Eben Alexander, auteur donc d'un best-seller mondial. Merci.
Well, greetings. It's a joy to be here. This is my first trip to Morocco. Karen and I have had a fantastic time. Of course, it's not just Morocco, it's the Moroccans who we love so much. A beautiful people. And I want to thank Jean Stone, my very good brother and friend, and of course everyone here at the university who is responsible for this beautiful conference that we're having. So, what I want to do is share a personal story, and this has to do with a transformation. I grew up in a scientific family. It turns out I was adopted. My adoptive father was a globally renowned neurosurgeon. Fortunately, he also had a very strong belief in God. In fact, neurosurgery for him involved prayer and knowing that there was a loving personal God out there. Now, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and like so many of us from that era, I always knew that science was the pathway to truth. I'm more of a scientist now than I've ever been, but I've also been challenged with a personal experience that greatly kind of violated my notion of the way the world works. And my previous position, and this included more than 15 years of teaching neurosurgery at Harvard Medical School, was one of physicalism or materialism. That's our conventional training, that only the physical world exists. And of course, there's an underlying kind of assumption there that somehow the physical matter of the brain creates consciousness. But one of the major issues with that model is if that's so, and if the brain is nothing more than subatomic particles, atoms, molecules, cells, all following the laws of physics, chemistry, and biology, then where in the world does free will come from? Many people in that kind of line of thinking would say that consciousness and free will are a complete illusion. And I would say that in fact, the journey I've been on has shown me clearly how we have beautiful free will, and that in many ways the entire future has to do with this beautiful expression of free will from our fellow beings and sentience. Now it turns out that the event that really changed my life occurred in November of 2008, 16 years ago, when I woke up in the morning with severe back pain, headache, and within a few hours lapsed into grand mal seizures and deep coma. I was then taken off to a hospital where I was diagnosed with a severe case of bacterial meningoencephalitis, and in fact went from a 10% chance of survival early in that week of coma on a ventilator down to about a 2% chance of survival by the 7th day of coma, with really no chance of recovery. My doctors were recommending stopping antibiotics and letting nature take its course. Well, of course, my family was suffering through all that, and what they were witnessing was my body on a ventilator, on an ICU bed for a week, doing nothing at all. Now for me, something else was going on, something absolutely astonishing, and I would say miraculous in many ways, and yet it's not a miracle because these experiences are very, very common. There are literally millions of people in this world who have had near-death experiences. They can be extremely shocking. Many people won't even talk about it. They're so amazed by the experience. And yet they are extraordinary, and when you study them en masse, you can end up learning some tremendous lessons about what I think is the nature of reality and where we're headed. Now, my near-death experience involved starting in a very primitive course level, but then through kind of a musical portal of light, led up into this brilliant ultra-real gateway valley that in many ways for me, I would say was like Plato's world of ideals, but for the individual soul. There was a tremendous amount of perfection there, but that would also be a place where we review the various events of our lives and things like that. Now, in this rich spiritual journey, I ascended to higher levels, all the way beyond a boundary that I think often stops some souls, and that beyond the boundary was a complete resolution of all dualities. It was a oneness with that divine, infinitely loving God force. And I know many other near-death experiencers have come to the same territory. But the beauty of it is, at that central core, the very sanctum sanctorum of the divine in my journey, you find there is not some battle between good and evil, but that in fact it is the pure love of that God force. And it doesn't matter what you want to call that. To me, God, Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh, these are all referring to a very similar kind of experiential piece that's at the core of our very conscious awareness. Now, in this entire journey, I would cycle through these levels multiple times and then finally ended up coming back here. But it's important to point out that one of the most essential and comforting features of my journey was a beautiful young woman that accompanied me through part of the journey in that middle layer, the one that had many earth-like features but was like a world of ideals. And I'll never forget her beautiful face, sparkling blue eyes, high cheekbones, broad smile. She looked at me with a look of pure love, and never did she say a word, but she didn't have to. Her message was telepathically delivered to me in this pure emotional state of complete overlap of our awareness. And that message, when I translated it weeks later, coming back to this world, was, "You are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are richly loved, richly cherished." And it turns out that the real kind of heart of the story for me is, as much as all of this seemed much more real than this world, my doctors would tell me, well, the dying brain plays all kinds of tricks. You can forget about it. Well, my neurosurgical knowledge took about 2 months to come back because amnesia was a huge part of my journey. Again, that was part of the lessons, learning about memory and consciousness. And it turns out that that vision of her was very mysterious. I'd never paid attention to the NDE literature before, but after this, you can bet I wanted to read everything I could. My older son, majoring in neuroscience in college at the time, advised me to write everything down before I read anyone else's account. That's the best advice I've ever gotten. I wrote about 20,000 words and then dove into the NDE literature and was shocked by so many of the similarities. But one thing that was haunting was I found that you have a spiritual guide there in the core of this kind of journey, but they're usually someone very important to you in life. And yet I had no idea who this beautiful woman was. So what actually got my attention was about 4 months after this, when I was deeply mystified, really struggling to even understand it all, and I got a picture in the mail. The picture was from my birth sister. I had met my birth family finally 1 year before my coma, and it was of the sister who had passed over, a sister that I'd had who died long before I knew of her existence. And it turns out, when I got that picture, I recognized that beautiful spiritual guide on the butterfly wing. And I cannot tell you what an incredibly revolutionary moment that was in my life. My heart was pounding. I collapsed to the floor. I couldn't even stand up for 30 minutes. Absolutely astonishing, because it showed me it seemed way too real to be real, because it really happened. It didn't happen in this material world, but it happened in a world that is very important to all of us, a spiritual source of our existence. Turns out that meningitis, in many ways, is a perfect model for human death. The reason is modern neuroscience would proclaim that the outer surface of the brain, the neocortex, is the calculator that is especially important for all the details of conscious awareness. Everything we see, everything we hear, smell, memories of the past, executive function, projection to the future. Every bit of that, movement, sensation, is accomplished in the 6 cell layers of the neocortex. Meningitis destroys that. And this meningitis was very severe. In fact, there's a medical case report that was written by 3 doctors not involved by care, but fascinated by my recovery. That came out in February of 2018. And that particular report made 2 very important points. One is, as a neuroscientist, if you read that report, you'll realize the details are there to prove that my brain was in absolutely no shape to harbor any kind of dream or hallucination. And it turns out the other important point is when the peer review editors of the Journal of Mental Diseases challenged the authors and said, how do you explain this? This is an unprecedented case of recovery, to have full neurologic recovery after this situation. And they said, it's because he had a near-death experience. And the peer review editors said, okay, now we have an explanation. They knew of other similar cases of NDEs with apparently miraculous healing. So you can consider my journey as being one of a blessing or a curse. For me, absolutely a blessing. I couldn't be more grateful for having spent a week in coma due to severe bacterial meningitis. It was one of the greatest gifts of my life. But in terms of a curse, trying to share that journey in a meaningful fashion with my fellow scientists and everything like that, it is a challenge because of a lot of the prejudices in our modern world, especially in the scientific community, against spiritual matters. Although it turns out that within about 2 years of my coma, I came to recognize that there was a huge scientific community out there studying these events, and that in fact they'd already done a tremendous amount of work kind of connecting the science and the spirituality. And those are groups that I even work with to this day. Now it turns out near-death experiences have been with us for thousands of years, across all cultures, across all continents. And these reports can be quite extraordinary. Of course, many people think they're just dreams or hallucinations, but I promise you they are not. We must take them much more seriously if we're to come to any kind of deep understanding of the nature of our reality. I would say that all of our religious systems in many ways have depended on these kinds of stories of people who witnessed God and in these kind of near-death situations. Now, it turns out that although I say they're common, they go back thousands of years, it's also important to point out that per capita, they were not very common. In fact, they were very unusual. And in 1968, doctors developed techniques to resuscitate cardiac arrest patients. And that has made a tremendous difference because since that time, we have now populated this world with hundreds of thousands of souls who have been to the other side in, say, a 4, 10, 20-minute cardiac arrest, or even longer. I know of people with NDEs who have been dead in a morgue for up to 3 days. So they can be in extraordinary kind of circumstances. But many of the reports come from people who have had a cardiac arrest and were then resuscitated. And I would say that because of all of this, for me, and certainly for many scientists who study these things, my concepts of consciousness, the brain, spirit, and soul were completely wrong before my coma, and that the brain does not create consciousness. That's a really important lesson. It serves more as a transceiver. Used to be the analogy back in the time of William James was a reducing valve, because steam engines were the big technology then. We make the same mistake today of saying that computers and brains are similar, as William just pointed out. No, they are not. And so this is not about looking at the brain as a computer, but really as a transceiver. And the notion there is that it actually is in communication with a consciousness that is far more primordial in this universe. Now, we saw earlier today, John Stone showed that quote from Richard Conn Henry. That was on the mental universe, a one-page essay in the highly esteemed scientific journal Nature in 2005. And for me, when I encountered that essay, it brought such clarity because I knew quantum physics had to be deeply involved, because I knew as a neuroscientist that every neuron is essentially a quantum computer. They don't operate by the laws of Newtonian determinism like billiard balls on a billiard table, but in fact the ions and the ion channels and the neurotransmitters and synaptic vesicles are all right there in the regime of the atomic level of the quantum world. And that's why quantum physics is so relevant to something like consciousness. Now, Karen and I wrote a book called Living in a Mindful Universe. It's also published in French by Guy Tredaniel. But in that book, Living in a Mindful Universe implies that mind is a property of the universe. And I would say, yes, that is absolutely the case. And in fact, the physical world in many ways is subservient to that mental layer of the universe. In this book, we discussed contextuality. Contextuality is the notion that if you look at a really deep, deep question like consciousness, and you look at it from many widely disparate kind of directions or perspectives, if they all tend to give you the same answer, pay attention. So in this particular discussion, that would involve the hard problem of consciousness in neuroscience, something elaborated by David Chalmers, an Australian philosopher back in the mid-1990s. It's basically an impossible problem for materialism to try and come up with how consciousness could emerge. The binding problem in the philosophy of mind, that's this unity of consciousness that all of us know what it's like, the unification of our mind, everything that we see, hear, smell, memories of past events, projection of future, executive function. Every bit of that seems to be kind of one coherent whole. It's very difficult to explain how that would happen in a system that has multiple neuronal populations contributing information. And I would submit that the reason consciousness seems so unified is because it comes into us filtered as a unified form. And in fact, we are really an eddy current of dissociated consciousness from that primordial mind, that God mind. And the association principles are very important in kind of getting to the bottom of this. But that binding problem is a really difficult challenge that has the best answer in a form of idealism, mind or spirit over matter. There are also many examples of non-local consciousness. So in neuroscience, we conventionally tend to think, here's my brain creating my consciousness. It can only know things that are just right here. And yet we know from scientific experiments that remote viewing is a very real phenomenon. This is a technique. Some may have heard of it as kind of psychic spy programs. Intelligence agencies have used these. I prefer to think of the more humanitarian uses of remote viewing, like in archaeology, to find ships and digs. And remote viewing has been very successful at doing that kind of thing. Likewise, for example, that Ingo Swann, a famous remote viewer in the US back in the 70s, remote viewed the blue ring of Jupiter 6 years before the Voyager spacecraft flew by Jupiter and revealed a blue ring. But he had seen it long before. And so remote viewing, although Wikipedia will tell you it's pseudoscience, that's because Wikipedia is a pseudo-encyclopedia. If you pay attention to the statements of Jessica Utz, who is the head of the American Statistical Association in 2015, and she basically reviewed twice. She reviewed over 20 years of data of remote viewing statistics, including, in this particular study, 227 individual subjects who were doing remote viewing. And in her presidential address, she said the chances that all of the observations in these many studies that she referenced, that all of them were just due to chance, would be around p less than 10 to the minus 20th. So it's real. It's a very real effect. And she said if it weren't so kind of sensitive as a topic, we would have accepted it long ago. Now, it turns out that near-death experiences are another form of this non-local consciousness. There are others, too, that we discuss in the book. But all of it seems to give us this picture that consciousness is fundamental. Consciousness is primary in the universe and appears to be very unified. And I would say that's exactly that God consciousness that I and so many other near-death experiencers have come into in these extraordinary journeys where our conscious awareness is liberated from the shackles of the physical brain and body. Now, you heard a wonderful talk this morning from William Phillips on quantum biology, and he talked about how chilly it is in the place he works, a tiny fraction of a degree above absolute zero. Well, it turns out for many years in quantum physics, they thought that was the regime of the quantum, was the extremely cold, laboratory settings, etc. But more recent work in biology has realized that quantum physics is extremely important in the warm, wet, mushy world of living life in our era. And the examples I will give: photosynthesis. Right there at the bottom of the food chain, quantum mechanics and tunneling is very, very important at efficient shuttling of electrons in the chloroplast in plants. That's the origin of all of our food, is something that depends tremendously on quantum effects. Likewise, the human sense of smell. Very difficult to kind of explain its incredible spectrum and range, and yet new work with quantum physics, again showing tunneling in olfactory neurons, has enabled us to better explain olfaction. Another beautiful example of biological quantum effects: bird migration. It turns out that birds, many migratory birds, are able to see a magnetic field. They don't see pole to pole, they see pole to equator, but they can use that very effectively for migration. Imagine if we had that kind of ability. It would be wonderful. So I think in this discussion of quantum physics, quantum biology, it's important to point out these kind of things you encounter, like contextuality, the measurement paradox, the fact that the mind making a decision about experimental observations seems to have a very kind of deep role that affects the objects that we're studying. So the measurement paradox, a very strong indicator that the world that we're witnessing really depends on the presence of mind, and not simply on the laws of physics governing all the interactions of material stuff. It turns out John Archibald Wheeler, who was head of physics at Princeton for many years, he was in the Manhattan Project, and he came up with a notion of a participatory anthropic principle to help explain the measurement paradox, to explain very deep issues. For example, when he talked about that principle, he was actually looking at what was called a delayed choice quantum eraser experiment. And in that work, he was really probing very deeply into the workings of subatomic particles, moving at the speed of light through this apparatus and using very high-speed gates to kind of change it up on the particles. And it turns out that a lot of his work really supports what he said: to be is to be perceived. And he said in the paper that I saw where he wrote that, he said he was in agreement with George Berkeley, an Irish theologian who had lived 200 years earlier, who was a renowned idealist, mind over matter, although I would say Berkeley's version of that is one of solipsism, where you can't really tell if the other minds out there are real minds. And the emerging kind of idealism of today is clearly one where multiple minds exist, but they're all basically sharing that God mind as the source of ultimate consciousness. The primacy of mind is something I would also refer to the work of John C. Eccles, because I was very interested as a neuroscientist to try and figure out better what's going on with neurons and how they're behaving as a quantum system. And he wrote a beautiful book in 1994. It's called How the Self Controls Its Brain. Now, Eccles won a Nobel Prize in physiology in 1963. He's an Australian physiologist who had studied ion channels and synaptic vesicles. And I will tell you that that is certainly, as I mentioned a little while ago, that is the realm of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. So by the very tight confinement and spatial localization of ions and synaptic vesicles, what you end up doing is greatly extending that momentum vector, which means that you cannot necessarily predict with any kind of Newtonian deterministic ability whether the neuron is even going to fire. there are other principles that are at work here. And I love this quote from Eccles, where he said, "I maintain that the human mystery is incredibly demeaned by scientific reductionism, with its claim in promissory materialism to account eventually for all of the spiritual world in terms of patterns of neuronal activity. This belief must be classed as a superstition. We have to recognize that we are spiritual beings with souls existing in a spiritual world, as well as material beings with bodies and brains existing in a material world." So what I'm implying is the kind of fire, no fire decision made by neurons is something that is influenced by a top-down system of causality. And this is where the work of George F.R. Ellis, a South African mathematician, has written extensively on top-down organizing principles in quantum physics. And I think if we extend that kind of research over time and use that kind of model, ultimately we're going to start getting a much more satisfactory answer as to how this idealism works, how the brain can serve as a filter for a higher form of consciousness. Now, we've already heard about the Nobel Prize to John Clauser, to Alain Aspect, to Anton Zeilinger in 2022 for entanglement. Now, there are many quantum physicists out there who will tell you that entanglement, it might appear mysterious, and of course we think consciousness is mysterious, but they will proudly say that these two mysterious things are not related. Well, I think that there's more of a connection than many of them might believe, and there certainly are a fair number of scientists studying consciousness, including a lot of physicists, who do believe that entanglement is part of this mental connection. Now, of course, Dr. Phillips would tell us pretty rapidly that at our current state of understanding of all this, that you cannot pass information faster than light by the principles of entanglement. But I think it remains that the very showing of this entangling phenomenon in the universe means that we've moved beyond four-dimensional space-time as the ultimate theater of operations of physics. We really need to understand that there are much deeper connections across our universe that help to explain all this and how it works. And entanglement is really just the beginning. I see the mind of the universe, that God mind, as connected. And the other important point to say is for all those years of Newtonian determinism and Newtonian physics, and even including moving into relativity and Einstein and all of that, there was this notion of local realism. You've heard that mentioned earlier. It's basically the idea that physics is local. It's all about the particles of physics interacting, touching, interacting locally. And also realism, the notion that an objective reality exists before you observe it. But as was so beautifully put today by many of the speakers, it turns out that is just one of those, if not both, are false. That is, local realism is no longer true. Now, some of the scientific writers, not scientists, but the scientific press, would they entertain that information by saying, say goodbye to realism. And they would write a sensational article like that. But I would say, let's be more comforted by this. It's not a goodbye to realism. It's a hello to consciousness. And it's a hello to our connectedness with that beautiful, loving God force and our connectedness with each other. So this finding of these findings of quantum physics in the modern era, and as we explore in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, really do open the possibility that we're all truly in this together. So in that kind of concept, I'd like to take us back very briefly to where I started with near-death experiences and mentioned, for example, there was a book by Ken Ring in 2008. He was an NDE researcher, and he wrote a book called Mindsight. And in that book, he basically talked about there were 30 or so people who had been blind, some of them blind from birth. And what he recognized was when they had near-death experiences, they could see. And they would describe things. Now, it's not seeing with the eyes. This is an important thing to understand. There are other ways of knowing. And this kind of vision would be kind of holoscopic. You would see through things. You would kind of sense three-dimensional structure. So it's a very enhanced form of what we might call holovision or enhanced perception. but it was very common in these particular blind patients who ended up having near-death experiences. And again, it also points out that near-death experiences are not just vague hallucinations or dreams. They are profound connections with the spiritual world, with our very origin. They are part of who we are. One other category I will mention before I close, shared death experiences. Shared death, very similar to near-death experiences, but happen to perfectly healthy people, usually a loved one. I was reading one just the other day of a man who was mowing his lawn, and all of a sudden he felt severe chest pain, and he fell to the ground, and he had this vision of angels, and then he saw his father in this glowing white robe, and then the vision kind of dissipated. And then he got a call that his father had died. His father died of a heart attack. And now they don't always involve the physical pain of the person passing over. In fact, it's often just the beauty of the journey they're having, even the point of witnessing a full-blown life review before they come back to this world. So shared death experiences, and you could learn more at sharedcrossing.com. The final example, terminal lucidity, where people who are extremely ill might have been comatose for months or years. Right before death, and statistically it's likely within hours to days of death, they come back to life. And they can be communicative with loved ones at the bedside. I have in the book Proof of Heaven, there's one example of that, of terminal lucidity. It's an absolutely shocking thing, but it shows the reality of the soul, and that consciousness is not simply created by the brain. The life review that is commonly referred to in near-death experiences, where your life flashes before your eyes. These go way back in time, but the series I want to talk about here, these are reviewed by Bruce Grayson in the Journal of Near-Death Studies, fall of 2021. Grayson is a skeptical psychiatrist who has studied near-death experiences for more than 45 years, and in this report, he talked about 698 life reviews in several thousand NDE cases he had. Importantly, 37% of the life reviews involved entire lives. You might wonder, how can an entire life happen over a 10-minute cardiac arrest? It's because in that realm, you're completely outside of Earth time. So an entire life can happen. 47% reported that the events were relived, not just remembered. In fact, I was reading an account not long ago of a man who drowned when he was a young lad, and in his NDE, he could count the number of mosquitoes in the lake above him. 76% stressed that the review was from the perspective of others. This is the most important point from where I see, and that is that when we have a life review, we feel what it was like in our interactions with our fellow beings. If we mistreated others, selfish, greedy, what have you, in the life review, that doesn't feel very good. So the life review, and I think our ideas of hell come from life reviews where people handed out a lot of pain and suffering to others. And in their life review, they're on the receiving end of that. So the most beautiful aspect of this, the golden rule, treat others as you would like to be treated, is written into the fabric of the universe through these life reviews that are commonly reported in these extraordinary journeys. Finally, 84% of these life review reports were more real than lived experience. So I think to kind of bring it all together in terms of trying to focus, I would say that beautiful quote that Jean Stone gave this morning from Sir James Jeans, I guess he ran out of room at the end of the slide, because what he says is, mind no longer appears to be an accidental intruder into the realm of matter. We ought rather hail it as the creator and governor of the realm of matter. So in other words, this kind of mind over matter, spirit over matter is not just some subtle effect, but has tremendous power. That's why human free will is so important, and that we can change this world for the better. All of this work is something that talks about the primacy of consciousness, supports the reality of the soul, but most importantly, it shows that we are all in this together. We're here to help each other. And that's where the most successful kind of NDEs and life reviews have been, is from people who came back teaching this lesson of love, compassion, kindness, mercy, acceptance, that is right there at the core of our existence, at the core of our soul in these spiritual journeys. And I would say that our work today is about consolidating a worldview that really brings the science and spirituality together, because they strengthen each other. But we must be bold and not defer to our theoretical models that may not cover all this, but instead follow the empirical data. It's all leading in one direction. There's no question where it's headed. We are awakening. And the false sense of separation that is inherent in materialism has been very damaging to our world, especially when combined with kind of, I would say, improper interpretations of Darwinian selection, which in the mid-20th century were really focused on survival of the fittest and competition, where most biologists today will tell you collaboration, cooperation. These are the keys to success in the biological world. And certainly for sentient beings, for humans like us who are truly spiritual beings living in a spiritual universe, this offers us the tremendous power to bring success, harmony, and love to this world at large. So with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for this wonderful conference, and God bless you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, John Stone.
Alors, voilà un petit dessin de Luc au passage. Et il y avait énormément de choses dans ce qu'on a vu, évidemment. Donc, je dirais simplement 2 choses ou 3. C'est sur le problème, effectivement, de la conscience qui n'est pas créée par le cerveau. Il y avait des arguments très intéressants, comme les études très poussées sur le fait que les gens dans la NDE revoient leur vie de façon incroyablement détaillée en 10 minutes. Et que donc, ça ne peut pas se dérouler dans l'espace-temps. Vous ne pouvez pas revoir votre vie entière en 10 minutes. J'ai fait une NDE, je flottais au-dessus de l'armoire quand j'ai vu où tu cachais les chocolats, évidemment. Si on pouvait faire une NDE, ce serait pratique pour voir. Et dans mes dernières volontés, j'ai décidé de léguer mon âme à la science. Oui, c'est une belle idée aussi. Comment léguer son âme à la science. Merci, Luc. Donc, il y aurait beaucoup à dire parce qu'évidemment, d'un côté, vous savez que la science, c'est un phénomène de peer review. On en parlera dans la table ronde. Il y a des choses qui ne sont pas encore reconnues. Ce sont des indices. Il a parlé de parapsychologie. Il a parlé de tas de données qui sont des indices de tas de choses. Mais si on met tout cela ensemble, je pense que ça forme une image assez forte, encore une fois, ce n'est pas une preuve, mais une image assez forte du fait qu'effectivement, la conscience est bien plus riche que ce que la science actuelle matérialiste peut envisager.